Hi everyone, I'm Michelle Sibanda and I am going to be interviewing Blaque Nubon today. We will be chatting about the topic of Christianity in context. Before I jump into my first question, I'd like to introduce you to Blaque. Blaque loves and follows Jesus. He's married to Lily and together they have one daughter. She's 3 years old and her name is Zaya. He is the young adults pastor at Christchurch Midrand and he is currently studying a Master's of Religion with the aim of opening a Christian center for cultural engagement. Hello, Blaque.
Hey, Michelle.
I'm happy to be here with you today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So let's jump in.
Cool. Let's do it.
So what does it mean to contextualize the Christian faith?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and I think a question that should constantly be on our minds as Christians. But it's helpful, I think, to understand what contextualization is, and Professor Lamin Sani, the late Professor Lamin Sani, helps us with these ideas of world Christianity versus global Christianity, and I think in understanding what those are, unpacking what those are, it helps us understand what contextualization is. So, what is global Christianity according to Professor Lamin Sani? Well, it's a Eurocentric Christianity that deals with recipient cultures from the top down, and what that means is it's a Christianity that wants to impose and is concerned about its own economic and social and most of the time political ideologies, and it transports that into the recipient culture. And so much of the gospel, or what is historic Christianity, is lost in that transition. But what world Christianity is Christianity that understands that the gospel is a power, God's power to be precise. We don't have to add to it, we don't have to twist it, we don't have to change it. We just drop it in any culture and it does what the gospel will do. And the gospel will do many things, but I think in light of our question, I will bring up two things that it will do in light of contextualization. One, it will redeem, and secondly, it will reveal. Right? So it will redeem the good aspects about that culture that are already woven into that culture in how God has wired the people of that specific culture. So this could be food, music, dress, wedding practices, etc., etc. There's always good things about every single culture in the world. And so the gospel will redeem those, and so that people in that culture will then use those good things to enjoy them and glorify God in the process. But what the gospel also does is it reveals. It reveals the things about each culture that have set themselves up as more glorious than God. And so what the recipients of the gospel in that culture will need to do is that the things that are revealed as idols, they'll have to get rid of those so that they're not hindered in their worship to the true God. And so that's what contextualization will look like in every culture. We'll need to redeem, and it will reveal. And so we'll celebrate the good things, but we'll get rid of the things that set themselves up against God. And every culture has to do the work of figuring out what those things are. Dr. Conrad says that for Christianity to live in Africa, it has to wear African clothes, it has to wear African shoes, and so every African culture, because again, Africa is not a monolith, and not every African country has the same culture. Even us in South Africa, there's various multiple cultures, and so each culture will have to figure out what are the good things that need to be redeemed, amplified, made much of, so that they glorify God and we enjoy them, and what are the things that have set themselves up as idols that we need to get rid of. And so we have to figure that out. So contextualization is important, and I think every Christian has to do it.
Sure, that's very helpful, especially because you understanding what you've just explained gives you a vocabulary.
Sure.
Because I think as a lay person who has a perception of Christianity, you would think, what did you call it? Is it international?
So global and world Christianity.
Global.
Yeah.
You would think Christianity is global Christianity.
Yeah.
And so you brought out this idea of global Christianity and world Christianity, which is super helpful.
And that's what people fight against.
Yeah.
Especially I find it now in South Africa, young black people who are opposed to Christianity are actually fighting a global Christianity. But I think they haven't been introduced to world Christianity or done enough work themselves to actually investigate the Christian faith, to find out that Christianity has existed in Africa even before it went to Europe. It was in Africa, and what did it look like for those 4th century African Christians, and so every generation and every culture will have to do the work as they receive the gospel, to say, how will this look like in our own time, in our own generation. And there's multiple stories as well of how there's certain missionaries, I know the Moravian missionaries who came to Cape Town and were missionaries sent to the Khoisands, and just how they lived with them. Didn't change the way they dressed, didn't change the way they built their houses, didn't change the way they made their food, but instead they brought the gospel and again did exactly those two things: revealed the things that were idols and that they needed to get rid of, but also redeemed the good aspects about the Khoisan culture. So there's a whole lot of history around how those kind of two Christianities have played side by side in history. So yeah.
Great.
Cool.
So I guess we could zero in on world Christianity then.
Yeah.
Is there a biblical basis, for that kind of contextualization?
Yeah. Sure.
Could you explain what it is?
Yeah. I think there is, and we find it in the Great Commission. So in Matthew 28, 16 till the end of that chapter. But Jesus commands his disciples there first he tells them in verses 18 that he has been given authority on earth and in heaven, and I think he gives them confidence and reassurance again of his sovereignty over the world. So there's no square inch of the world that Jesus does not own. He owns all of it. And so that gives his disciples confidence to go into every nook and cranny of the world, knowing that he's the boss of the world.
Even though it feels unfamiliar.
Hundreds. But he has that authority, and so we can have confidence to go anywhere, because that is actually the second thing that he tells them. Verses 19, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. And the command there is to go. And as you're going, you make disciples, right? So they started off in Jerusalem, and they're gonna end up they're basically gonna cover the whole earth. And we Christians sitting here today because they were faithful to that Great Commission, and that Great Commission still applies to us today. So as they're going, they're gonna obviously interact with people from various nations, people of different cultures, different people groups. That's who they're going to meet. And then in verses 20, he gives them the command to contextualize, teach them all that I've commanded you. Right? And so teaching will mean that they'll have to contextualize this good news about what Jesus has done for these people they're going to be interacting with. So I think in the Great Commission, we get the basis of why it is important for us to contextualize. Jesus, one, has authority everywhere, so we should go everywhere. Secondly, he tells us to go everywhere. Thirdly, he tells us to teach what he has already taught us. And so that will mean we have to preserve that good news, but find ways that will be palatable for the culture that the gospel interacts with. And by palatable, I don't imply that we change the gospel at all or we add anything to it. But again, we just do the hard work of getting muddy with the culture that we're going to be interacting with, and praying hard that the people of that culture get saved. And in fact, they're the ones who teach us, who bring the gospel, what their culture is like, and so that we can be more effective in how we penetrate that specific culture. So the biblical basis for me would be there.
That's a great point. Just how you highlighted God's sovereignty, and what stood out was just the world is not unfamiliar to God. No culture is unfamiliar to him. So you really go there as a Christian in faith, knowing that God will equip you to manage in the culture.
Hundreds,
Sure. So the next natural question, I think you've covered it a bit, is why is contextualization important? Why? So you've given us a biblical basis. I mean, that in and of itself speaks to why it's important. But can you just dig in deeper to why should I take it upon myself then to see it that way?
I think, so in thinking about the biblical basis for contextualization, Jason Georges wrote a very helpful book called The 3D Gospel, ministering in shame, honor, and guilt cultures. I might even be mixing the words now. But he paints very broad strokes on the cultural makeup of the world. And so he identifies 3 major cultures. And again, these are very broad strokes. But he speaks about how the West works on guilt and innocent axis. So most people in the West will think along those lines of guilt and innocence. But in the East, people think along the axis of shame and honor. And then in the South, people would think along the axis of fear and power. And so I think it helps understand how we then contextualize the good news to these various cultures. And so in the West, again, very broadly, you would preach a gospel that speaks of the innocence that Jesus has achieved for those who are guilty before the judge. In the East, you would preach a gospel that really brings the dignity and honor of people who have been stripped naked by sin and been left to be shameful. And then in Africa or in the South, you would preach a gospel of power, which the gospel is power, but how that power frees enslaved captives and releases them from spiritual bondage. And fear. So I think that's very helpful in trying to see how you can contextualize the good news that Jesus commands us to go teach in verses 20 of Matthew 28. So I think that's very helpful. And then whatever culture that you'll get into, I think there's obviously specifics, but it's helpful. I think in my experience, I've seen it's helpful keeping those broad categories and then working your way down into the specifics of what each culture looks like. And so how do you contextualize the gospel there?
Great.
Yeah.
That is very helpful. So I've asked you what is contextualization and what is the biblical basis. And you've touched on why it's important. I think the biblical basis on its own implies the importance. But could you just go deeper into its importance? So why should I take it upon myself to think in those broad categories? Why should I take it upon myself to try understand the context that I'm in for the sake of the gospel?
Yeah, so I think, one, if you're a Christian, it's you've been made by God in a specific way. You live in a specific culture. So I always say that I wasn't born a white kid in Sandton or a colored boy in Cape Town, but I was born a black kid in a township. I'm Zulu, and I have unique experiences, and those experiences are not unique in and of themselves, but they're unique because of God and how He's wired me and the things that He's allowed me to go through and see and learn. And so I think as a Christian, it would be important for me to understand why contextualization is important, because then I can make sense of my surroundings, of the world around me, and how then I faithfully, and not effectively, because sometimes I think we try and be effective Christians, which
have a great strategy.
Yeah. How do I become a perfect Christian? No,
Yeah.
but I think be a faithful Christian in the context that God has placed you in. So I'm not trying to live outside of my environment, because I think that would also be unfaithful. But I'm again using the good things that the gospel has unearthed and redeemed rather in my culture, and I'm embracing those, and I'm using them for my benefit and how to glorify God, and I'm shunning away all the things that are idolatrous. So as a Christian, I think that's why it will be important. It will help you to live as faithfully as you can. But as Christians who've been called to go make other disciples, I think it's important for us to contextualize. One, if we don't, then we run the risk of enslaving the gospel to our culture, right? And I think then we run the risk of ending up with a global type of Christianity. So if we don't contextualize and think about other people's cultures that we sharing the gospel with, the gospel will be enslaved in our culture, and then we'll start twisting it and making it sound and look and feel how we want it to, you know. And then our culture will be dominant over the gospel as opposed to the gospel being dominant over our culture. But then secondly, if we don't take the gospel to other cultures and therefore doing the hard work of and the muddy work of contextualizing the gospel for that culture that we're taking it to, then those people will be enslaved to their sin. If we don't take the gospel to them. And that's precisely why Jesus gives us the Great Commission. So souls are important, and if souls are important, contextualizing the gospel for the culture those souls find themselves in is therefore important, because then they would die in their sins and go to hell. And I think it also just moves the barrier of people thinking that we are bringing a global or Eurocentric kind of Christianity. So it moves that barrier when we interact with people of a specific culture. We contextualize the gospel for them, so they see that this thing makes sense for me where I'm at. And again, I think if Revelation is true, and we will have people from various cultures, languages, and people groups, then it starts now. It's not. That's not a.
It's not one day.
It's not a one-day thing.
It's now.
Exactly. You know. So we start now to contextualize the gospel for those different cultural groups or tribes or tongues or nations now, so that one day we'll all be together singing one song to the Lamb.
Great. So then let's turn to our context. What do you think young South African people need to hear from the church today?
So I think they need to hear what the church has been saying for the past 2,000 years. So I don't think we have to give a different message. I think young people in South Africa need to hear from the church that Jesus is more glorious than anything. I think the majority of young South Africans, which would be Black South Africans, come from families, spaces where materially the previous generation didn't have much when it comes to materials. And so I think I grew up with that as well, where we've been pushed into achieving a lot of things materially. So go get the education, go get the job, go live in Bryanston, Sandton, wherever, make money, look after the family back in the township or the village. And so most of us grew up with believing that there's endless possibilities and we can do whatever we want to do, but with the aim of just becoming rich. Right? If we put it bluntly,
being well off,
being very well off, being wealthy, being rich, and yes, we still take care of the family, etc., etc. But I think two things have happened with this group of young people in South Africa. The first thing is that there's a segment of this group that hasn't achieved this material success, and so they're very despondent, disillusioned. So there's a disenchantment that they've experienced, especially when it comes to the church as well. So we haven't achieved this material stuff, blah, blah, blah. So this hasn't worked. Why are you even telling me about Jesus or the church? How's that going to help me with this thing, right? So there's that one group. But the second group, they have achieved stuff, you know. So they drive the fancy car, they live in fancy estates, they look after the family back home, but they too are disillusioned. And the reason for that is, so you've gotten the six-figure check, but then the problems at home are increasing.
Sure.
Cousins are having more babies, so they're demanding more money from you.
Burdens are more.
Yeah. Your tastes are changing because you moved from, four-figure salary, five-figure, six-figure, and so now your lifestyle is also increasing. So your appetites are growing as well, which naturally happens. And so you got into a place where you're like, I've achieved all of this stuff, I've done things, but why am I feeling a sense of comfortable? I don't feel like I've settled, I've arrived. There's just a sense of disillusionment as well. And so I think both groups need the same message that the church has been preaching for the past 2,000 years. Jesus is more glorious than anything else, because at the end of the road of materialism is Ecclesiastes 5:10. Right? There's just no satisfaction, and there's no real love in chasing after material stuff. And Solomon reminds us of that in that verse. And he uses those two words that I think materialism promises, love and satisfaction. Sure. But you're never going to get that from materialism. You're only going to get that in Christ. And as the great hymn says, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and all the things on earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And the opposite is true. If we turn our eyes away from Jesus, then everything else will look shiny, and he will look dim. But at the end of the road of those shiny things, there's actually nothing.
There's no glory.
There's no glory at all.
Grace.
Yeah. So, and in no way am I saying that young black South Africans or young South African people shouldn't work hard.
Sure.
I think we should work hard. I think the pursuit of poverty is not biblical. Sure. And I think being lazy is a sin. So we need to work hard. We need to have a good work ethic. We need to provide for our families, look after ourselves.
We need to care about our families and if they're eating.
Care for the environment. And money does stuff like that. Sure. Money feeds, money clothes. But that should not be where we find our worth, identity, our sense of belonging, thinking that we're going to have satisfaction, purpose, meaning or love. Once we believe that lie, then we're gone. But the only way to not believe that lie and still work hard is to turn your eyes fully on Christ. And he should have the central place in your life. And the church should be working hard, especially now, because there's more shiny things now. The church should be working hard to just present an even more glorious vision of Jesus. And that's all we need to be seeing, just how glorious he is. An undeniable vision, that's going to capture the imagination of young South Africans, an undeniable vision that's going to awaken us from a material slumber.
I guess that speaks a lot about not only what the church needs to say, but what the church needs to be as well.
Yeah. Hundreds.
Great.
Hundreds.
So, speaking of what the church should say, do you think the church should be vocal or more vocal as and when issues arise in prominence in our society.
Yeah.
So corruption scandals, economic crises, crises,
Yeah.
economic crises, environmental concerns. In those situations,
Sure.
what does the church need to do?
Yeah, I think the church has been buckling under the pressure of like the social noise, if I should call it that, or buckling under social pressure. And whether that's because of the advent of social media, and therefore the world has become smaller, So you would cry about something on social media, I would see it, and then somebody else, in Cape Town will see the same thing.
Sure.
And then we think this one thing that happened to Michelle is happening to all of us.
Yeah.
And then the guy in Cape Town and I go back to our churches and put pressure on our
Sure.
pastors. This is what's happening in Michelle's life, so we need to talk about it as well. And so I think most churches, in the fear of not being relevant, in the fear of being seen as an institution or a body or a people who are on the wrong side of history, the fear of that,
which has happened so much.
Yeah. And so it's like, how do we not do that? How do we not become the people who are on the wrong side of history? How do we become the people who are not dinosaurs, but we need to be the people who are relevant, on point, on top of things, blah, blah. And so then they would buckle under that pressure and then, change sermons or create sermons that would speak into issues as they arise. But I think that's not the way that the church is supposed to function. Social issues don't make us relevant. What makes us relevant is the truth that God chose us, and He chose to work through us to achieve His plan of salvation. So the church has always been relevant because of its head. And that's what gives us relevance in this world. It's a dying world that needs salvation, and the church is the vehicle for that salvation. That's what makes us relevant, because of the one who provides the salvation. So I think we need to be reminded of that as a church, and I think we need to sit on that truth and be comfortable in that, because again, we are part of what God is doing. So the pressure is not on us to save people. It's God's job. He does that. It's a privilege for us to partner with Him as He does that. So I think we need to be comfortable in that, and not try and chase every other scandal or every other thing that arises, but also go back to the local church model that the Bible presents. So each local church is placed in a locality for a reason.
Yeah.
So if God has a global church, we know that, and that's all Christians across the world, but all those churches are in a specific locality, and God has placed you there so that He can take care of the people there. I work at a church in Midrand, and so God has placed us in Midrand first and foremost to look after the people from Midrand and to care for them and the issues that they are struggling with. And so I think what the church needs to do is to walk faithfully through the scriptures and preach the Bible faithfully. Does the Bible address every single thing in the world? No. But does it address most of the issues in the world? Yeah. Fatherlessness, corruption, racism, sexism, all of that stuff the Bible does address. And so the job of the minister is to walk his congregation, or the people God has entrusted him with, through the scriptures faithfully, and as they walk through the scriptures faithfully, things will arise. And they will see things that are probably issues in their context. They'll be equipped to go address them, but before they address them, they'll be equipped to pray for those things, and to see how God has interacted with all of these things. Because again, another thing, these things are not new. So God has interacted with them. He has people in the scriptures who were in those situations, and so we could learn and glean from their experience and see how we can then apply all of that to our context. So I think those two things, we need to be comfortable in that, comfortable in knowing that this is God's church. It's a privilege that we're partnering with him. We don't have to panic to make ourselves more relevant, but then we need to do the hard and messy and muddy work of walking through the Bible and understanding it, to apply it to our local context first before we think about stuff that's happening at a national level, continental level, or even at a global level. Let's be faithful where God has us first, you know. And I'll end here because I talk too much. But you'll get people who are worried about, let's say, racism. And it's a big thing. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about it. We should, and we should tackle it head on. It's a sin. It's an evil. But you'll be worried about a racist incident that happened, you know, like...
In Australia.
Right? 20 hours away from where you are. And that thing would pain you. But right across your church corner, there's a woman who's been abused by her husband, you know. Up the next apartment or house, there's kids who are hungry. And here you want to flip your whole sermon and make it about racism that's 20 hours away, and yet you're not concerned about the people that God has placed in front of your doorstep. And so let's not buckle under the pressure of what's happening in the world, and really look at where God has us and what are the needs of our locality. Yeah.
That's really helpful. And what I sort of hear coming through is that we do need to trust that the God who is sovereign over all the world is able to work through his people everywhere. It only makes sense. So it's good to be concerned, but you're not the only person who God uses by nature of you being, by virtue of you being part of a church, a global, universal church. God is working.
He is.
Sure.
He is.
Great. So you touched on it, that we're in an age of social media. Do you think social media can be important for church? Sort of, let's say, any local church, should they be concerned about their social media presence?
Yeah, sure. I used to think so. I used to think that it's like a major concern. And maybe I was just thinking as a millennial, you know. And then, especially at the height of the pandemic, I was reading a lot of books about the future, the church of the future, you know, and how churches need to basically adapt, polish their social media presence, and strategies and all of that stuff. But as I read, I just did not find any compelling arguments that that's the way the church should go. And I mean, if we think about Facebook specifically, you know, I'm like, Facebook has lost so many of its followers in the past year. I don't have the exact numbers, but I was reading an article and then I saw a news broadcast as well, just reporting on the money Mark Zuckerberg has lost because of the drop of followers, you know. So, and we've seen it with other networks, you know. So there's networks that have been bought by other networks, or they've just fallen off the face of the earth, because there is a trendy thing about being on social media, and trends, fads, they
spike.
Yeah, and then they go very quickly. And so again, our concern as Christians or as a church should not be to jump on trends. That's not our calling. You know, trends will be here, and there is a way in which we can interact with them, but we shouldn't have the rhythms or the culture of our church be dictated by trends or social media, you know. So I don't think that it should be a major concern. Should churches be on social media? Sure. But should it be like a major concern now that you set up a whole department in your church for social media?
Social media manager.
Yeah.
Posts every week.
Listen, I'm going to get stoned for saying this, you know, but there's churches who have that stuff, that's fine. But there's many other churches
We don't.
And I think they need encouragement to know that just because you're not moving in that direction, you're going to be left out. Again, you're relevant because of your head, who is God. And the minute you move away from God and the minute you move away from the gospel, that's when you become irrelevant. But be faithful to who's called you, be faithful to what he's called you to do, and that's to proclaim the good news. And that's all you need to do. But I think, yeah, there should be other ways in which we are present online. We cannot avoid that reality. And so I think a good website with good resources that are first and foremost directed to your own congregants. So that could be sermons, could be videos that would feed your sheep that come to the church, and good SEOs, search engine optimization. So if you stay in Bryanston and somebody moves to Bryanston and they search for a church, a good SEO would ensure that they find your church, and it's clear. Your information is clear. It's clear what you guys stand for, what this thing is all about. And so find somebody who designs websites and just ask them about SEOs, and they could help you with that. And I think that's good enough to have, because again, you're attracting the people that are in your locality. So somebody who's searching for a church there, they'll come there, they'll do life with people who live there, they live there. And then the stuff that's on your website is directed first and foremost for your congregants. If somebody who's not a Christian finds it, hooray! We want to reach out to non-Christians and to the lost, and so they will meet Jesus through the resources that are part of your church. But I think most churches get lost in the noise of social media. So you set up social media manager, you put on a page.
You're on every network.
Every platform, Instagram, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. And so we'd ask the question, why? Well, most churches will say, because we're trying to reach the lost. Okay, that's a good enough reason. But there's 1,000 of you who are doing that. There's 5,000 other churches who are doing the same thing. So how are you adding anything different? Because essentially we're all giving Jesus. So why add a burden? Because for most churches it will be a burden, because they're pressured. There's resources, time, somebody to manage that. Because being a social media manager, ask anyone, that is a full-time job. It's not, if you want to do it properly. So one, you're going to be part of the noise. There's mega churches with mega budgets and mega productions that will make your efforts look like nothing compared to them, right? But then secondly, the people that you're trying to reach who are non-Christians already don't want anything to do with church. And so if they're being bombarded by 5,000 other churches, they're most likely going to turn off. So they might go to the big mega church because there's a production. Then you're going to turn off from your stuff because it's not even visually appealing. The aesthetics are not that amazing compared to the other churches. Or they just completely drop out. So all 5,000 of us who are going for the same person, we've lost that person, So
I guess that's how social media works.
So another reason would be we want to stay in contact with our people. And so my question then, or pushback, would be, how are you sure that the people, your congregants, would be on Facebook at a specific time or whenever? So you take Twitter, for example, where you put out a tweet, and literally every other tweet that comes after that pushes your tweet down, and that's why you need to constantly be tweeting. And I think it was probably like a tweet a minute for you to be seen and be relevant, and that's literally, I'm saying, every single minute throughout the day, because your tweet gets pushed. So how are you sure that Michelle is going to see your tweet? Or if you're on Facebook and you put the thing out, how are you sure that Michelle is going to be on Facebook that whole week to see your announcement? But Michelle comes to church on Sunday, she'll get the announcement. You surely have her direct line. You can SMS her or WhatsApp her. You have her email. You can email her. She definitely checks her emails daily. Or we have Bible study on Wednesday, Tuesday, whatever. We can still interact. So then what would be my real reason to say that I'm using social media for my congregants? So I think there is a sense in which this became a very big trend, and then churches felt like they were being left out, and they wanted to jump on the thing. But I do think having a website, having sermons on that, and other forms of resources, whether it's teaching, training resources, I think is helpful. Yeah, and there's a whole lot of segments of our population that are probably not as social media savvy. But WhatsApp is actually a big thing in Africa. You know, like there's a whole lot of like organizations and movements that just are on WhatsApp. Data's cheaper on WhatsApp than it would be on Instagram, whatever. Going on a website is definitely cheaper in terms of data than being on social media. So why not just use that, and again think about the people that God has already brought into your congregation. You need to take care of those people first and foremost, as you also take care of the lost and non-Christians who you're trying to share the gospel with so that they can get saved. But take care of your people first, and let all your resources be for that. Or not all your resources, but majority of your resources for that, and then whatever else you can use to reach the lost, put in teams for that, put in budgets for that, put in people for that, etc., etc. But I don't see how social media could be your primary tool.
It's not the end all and be all.
Yeah, of how you reach the lost. I think there's better ways of reaching the lost. Yeah.
Sure. Alrighty. So let's go to another sort of contextual issue. You touched on it when you spoke about global and world Christianity. I think another perception that people have is just that the church is not necessarily a place for sinners, really. Of course, the right answer is that it is, but the perception is that no, not really. The worst of the worst are not welcome.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that?
Yeah. So maybe two things to address there: how the perception was created, or how is the perception created and even sustained, and then, the question is church for sinners. So maybe we start with how the perception was created, and that's wholly on us as Christians. So as Christians, we can carry ourselves as people who are somewhat removed from the rest of the world. And in one sense, it is true, but that's not the attitude or the posture that Christ had, or even calls us to have. So you think of his high priestly prayer in John 17. He prays that God does not take us out of the world, but leaves us in the world and sanctifies us with his word. And I think it's important to even zoom on that word sanctify or sanctification. Anyone who's being sanctified knows that they're a sinner. Hence, they need sanctification. Anyone who's been cleaned knows that they're dirty. And so there's this dual existence, if I should call it that, as Christians. We know that we fully righteous because of what Christ has done for us. We know that we're fully forgiven. We know that we are clothed in goodness and holiness. We know that. And I think in Colossians 3, Paul even speaks about that. But there's a sense, again, in which we are still in this world. We're still dealing with the residue of our own sin. We're still dealing with the brokenness of this world. We're still dealing with our old patterns of thinking. We're still dealing with temptation, and so those two things exist simultaneously in the Christian. But what we tend to do is, because, and I'll be gracious here, because we love non-Christians and we love people who are lost, and I'll be gracious because sometimes it actually doesn't come across as love, but let's be nice. We love people, and so in our efforts to love them, we tend to love them maybe too hard, and not expose our scars, and not show the work that God is doing in our lives. And so we want to present ourselves as a picture of what they should...
The end product.
Yeah, what they should live like. And again, if I'm being gracious and nice, it's because we love them. And we see that you're not living a life that's going to end up in glory, or a life that's even good for you and conducive for you now. You know, maybe I have a friend who cheats on his wife, doesn't take care of his kids, he's constantly drunk. And so whenever I'm around him, because I love him and I care for him and I want him to live a better life, I'm presenting this picture of myself as somebody who's righteous, who has everything figured out, who's holy, and you need to be like this. You need to, and I think that's where the perception is created. And any human, even Christians, any human who gets presented a picture like that by another person, you think, well, I'll never be that. That's just hard. I'll never do that. That's just, it's not me. So clearly church is not for a person like me. Clearly church is for people like my friend here, who's righteous, who's upright, sometimes uptight, but upright. And I'll never be that, and so I think Christians need to not present that perception, but really present the reality of who they are. You sinners who are saints, right? Or saints who are sinners. You're sinners who are being sanctified. Expose yourself, expose your scars. And by doing that, again, we move the glory away from us. Because my friend thinks that he can't come to church because look at how glorious I am. But I'm not. And so therefore I'm also putting a burden on myself to maintain this picture of glory. But if I show how sinful I am, and again, I'm not saying I live in the sin with him.
Sure.
But I really live an honest life. Hey, I dress like this every time, so I'm not gonna change. I dress like this wherever I am. But in how I speak, I watch my words, not because I think I'm good or perfect, but because I love Jesus and I want to honor him. Do I see other women? Am I attracted to other women? Yes, I am. I'm a man. But do I choose to act on those impulses? No. I fight against those impulses because I love God and I love my wife and I love my family. How do I keep myself from fighting, from entertaining those impulses? Well, I have Christian brothers around me. Clearly, I can't do this thing alone. And I expose that to my friend. I have brothers who keep me accountable, people who pray for me. If I don't pray, if I don't read my Bible, I'm doomed. So I depend on God. I depend on his word. And I'm showing that, when I've blown up, I go and I say I've blown up, So I don't wait for the time where I've already dealt with my blow up. Everything is fixed, and I'm like, oh, by the way, last week this is what happened. Yeah, look at me now. I've conquered it, right? Yeah. But in the moment, I say, hey, listen, I've blown it, man. I lied to my wife about this, and here's why I lied, blah, blah, blah. But there's forgiveness in Christ. There's repentance. There's second chances in him, and live as authentic as I can. So I think we need to fix that perception. But is the church for sinners? Yes, it is. If the church is not for sinners, then it's not the church. In Ephesians 2:9 and 10, even in 19 and 20, if I'm not mistaken, those verses. But Paul speaks about this one direction that all of history is moving towards, and God is moving everything and putting it under Christ, who's the head of all. Right? So all of history is moving there. Everyone is moving there, whether you like it or not. Right? Everything is moving there. You'll bow to Christ willingly and confess that is Lord, or you'll bow just from the sheer force of being in his presence. But all of us are gonna bow, and so God is doing that through the church, and he's calling sinners, and he's moving sinners and the world in that direction. And so the church exists for sinners. God established the church so that his word can go out, his gospel could go out and reach sinners and bring sinners in. And so when it stops being a place for sinners, then it stops being what God intended it to be. It stops being the church.
Great. So on that same trajectory, can Christians really be salt and light in every single sphere of society? If you think of different careers, different places where you might live, different areas, should Christians be there?
Yeah.
Should you go there?
Yeah.
And can they really be salt and light?
Yeah.
Without being, I suppose, corrupted.
Yeah, I think we can and we should. So when Jesus speaks of us being salt and light on the Sermon on the Mount, it doesn't come across as a suggestion. It comes across as a command and an identity statement. This is who you are. This is who you will be. So you are salt and light, therefore be salt and light. Hence he says, how can
if salt loses its saltiness.
Yeah. Then what purpose does it have? Can light be placed underneath, and be covered? So be who you are. Don't live as something you're not. You are salt, you are light, therefore be salt and light and live in that regard. The tricky thing is then applying that. So then people will say, well, it's easy if you're a pastor.
Yeah.
It's easy if you an apologist or you're an evangelist. It's easy for you to be salt and light but how am I salt and light as an accountant? How am I salt and light as an artist? How am I salt and light as a model? Whatever the case is. And so again, speaking about this whole thing of contextualizing our faith, it is the job of the Christian to figure that out for herself, where she is. And so you need to say, I'm an artist. What is it about my art that glorifies the Lord? And those things I will redeem, make much of, speak of, use. What are those things in my art, or even in the sphere or space of art, that set themselves up as more glorious than God? Things that set themselves up as idols. And how do I communicate art or make art or create art that will speak against that? And sometimes, since I'm speaking about art, sometimes people will think that it's art that's directed in the sense that you'll say in a song maybe, don't go do this, or paint a painting with a cross or an X that says danger, don't do this, But I'm like, there's very artistic ways and poetic ways in which you can communicate to the soul.
Less literal.
Yeah, very less literal. And I think so. It's the job of the artist to figure that out. As an accountant, just don't steal people's money. That's how you become salt and light. Just don't jack people. Don't flip numbers. But make sure that you're doing your work with honesty. That it's ethical, and that it will glorify God. So just be truthful in the numbers. Don't inflate things. But also, you're living as a Christian. So you don't stop being a Christian just because you enter corporate SA. You don't. You're still a Christian, So how you interact with people in the office. Are your words loving? Are they building? Are you going to call out falsehoods when you see them? I was talking to my young adults about this and how to live as Christians in corporate SA. And I think the mistake that we make is maybe even asking that question. How do I live as a Christian here? Because the flip is, you don't get the non-Christians in your office walking in and saying, how do I live as a non-Christian in the space? They don't. They're just
themselves.
They're just humans. You an image bearer. You are representing God. So what will an image bearer do at the coffee station? You're not going to be mean to people. You're not going to finish the coffee and lie about it. You're just going to be there, having coffee with people, having wholesome conversations. If somebody says something that's unwholesome, I could use colorful words, but I'll just use unwholesome. How do you not, make it awkward for them? And you can't say that. But how do you, in a very tactful way, very loving way, gentle way, kind of rebuke that? And you have to figure that out because you know your office dynamics.
Sure.
Or how do you make sure that people know that you're not for that kind of stuff in a way that does not turn them off? If it does, that's fine, because you trying to live as salt and light in that space, So you have to figure that out for yourself. And again, another easy thing, you're not robbing the company of its time. So if you need to work from 9 to 5, just be faithful to that. You don't have to. You don't have to be on Facebook on company hours. You don't have to steal from your boss, by going on Instagram when you're supposed to be working.
Extended lunch breaks.
Extended lunch breaks, you know, because then you also creating a culture, or you perpetuating the culture that's there. So you need to be a person who redeems the good things about the culture. Having a lunch break is good. Redeem it by getting there on time and leaving on time. You know, so, and there's obviously then there's things you can do, reaching out to people, sharing your faith with them,
gospel.
inviting them to church. There's all of that stuff that you can do. But I think the biggest thing you can do is build relationships, because that's what keeps people engaged, is that if they know you genuinely care for them, and they're not just side projects, right, at the office, but you genuinely care. You spend 8 hours of your life there or even more. So those people, you should care for them. Invite them to your house, invite them to church, go to their houses, see how they live, but genuinely care. And if they feel that, that's an easy bridge that you can build. But yeah, we all need to figure out how to be salt and light. But everyone can. Yes. Everyone should.
Wherever they are.
Wherever they are, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Lastly, and sort of linked to that.
Yeah.
Is it especially hard to be a Christian today? You're living today in 2022.
Yeah.
In our age.
Yeah.
Is it especially challenging to be a Christian?
I can feel the stones coming. No, it isn't.
Done.
Done. Let's go home. And the reason for that, I think C.S. Lewis is helpful. So he speaks of this idea called chronological snobbery, believing that you're the first generation to go through a specific struggle or to even struggle.
Yeah.
And so you'd be very snobbish about your struggles, you know. No one has ever suffered like us. You know, the church 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, didn't have technology, and how things were coming at them so rapidly. Yeah, they didn't, but they were getting stoned. They were getting burnt. Right? They were getting crucified upside down. They were getting their limbs torn, you know, in different directions. That's what was happening. So are we going to sit here and now compare struggles? Their struggle was far worse than our struggle. Our struggle is far worse because of ABC, you know, and I'm like, that's just, again, that's snobbery. Do we have maybe one or two challenges that previous generations didn't experience? Yeah. But the same is true for them. They have one or two challenges that we'll never experience as well. And it's not about comparing the struggles, but I think it's knowing your enemy, because your enemy has not changed in the past 2,000 years. Satan has not changed. The world and its schemes have not changed. Your flesh has not changed. We're still humans, like Christians in previous generations. So sin is still here. Satan is still here. The world is still here. And Satan his cultural intelligence is way more than mine, and he will understand my culture way more than me, and he will twist things in my culture, the things that will set themselves up as more glorious than God. He knows how to play those things and use those to tempt me, like he did in previous generations. And so you will think our culture and our generation is unique, therefore we don't have the same struggles. Satan says, well, your flesh still reacts the same, temptation still works the same way, but there's things in your culture that I know, this is Satan speaking, I know that I can tweak
to trigger those things.
To trigger certain things. So our enemy has never changed, and so we should unite with Christians in our heritage, Christians in our history, Christians in our family tree, as it were. Unite with them in the struggle of fighting the same enemy that tried to destroy them and is trying to destroy us, with the same world and its schemes and its patterns that are trying to destroy us, like it tried to destroy them. You know, so we need to be fighting against that, hating sin the same way that the apostles hated sin, that the early church fathers hated sin, that people in the Reformation hated sin. We should hate sin the same way. Right? And push back against that and fight back against that. And instead of comparing struggles, but unite with them. And learn from how they fought and how they stood. You know, so let's not believe the lie that we somehow unique.
Therefore, we have no solutions.
Yeah. Or even
we need to figure out new solutions.
Yeah, exactly. We need to figure out new solutions, because then Satan has us.
Sure.
You know, so the solution has always been the same.
Yeah.
Jesus more glorious than anything, believing that he's finished what he's done on that cross, and he will do what he said he will do. And every generation has to believe that. We have to believe that as well. That's the struggle for all of us. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Jesus is more glorious than anything, and he will do what he said he will do. In spite of, or even with regard to, whatever context.
Yeah, hundreds.
Great.
Hundreds.
Thank you.